Hey, howdy, and welcome back. So today I want to go over a little bit of a controversial subject, especially in the military surplus community, and that is sporterization. So if you're not familiar with that, that is the idea and the practice of taking original military surplus firearms out of their configuration and then transforming them into sporting firearms, whether it be hunting, target, whatever. And nowadays that's incredibly frowned upon in the military surplus community. Because rifles in their original configuration are getting harder and harder to find. It's just supply and demand. Most of these rifles were made, approaching 80 plus years ago. And so you have to imagine how many were destroyed in combat, how many were destroyed for parts, and then how many were destroyed for things like this. So I know that there's people crying and puking and screaming right now, but at the same time you have to kind of reframe this and look back in history at how cheap and plentiful things like this were at the time. Brand new hunting rifles were considered relatively expensive, whereas you could go and get, for instance, a surplus 1917 rifle for relatively cheap comparatively. So that created the whole idea of sporterization. There was big waves of this in the 50s, 60s, and 70s with World War II surplus. There was kind of a bit of a die-off in the 80s. And then when the Soviet Union fell in the 90s and then a whole bunch more surplus got imported, that's when there was a little bit of a resurgence. And you'll see a lot of sporterized SKSs and especially Mosins. But I think that this particular example is one of the very few that is done relatively tastefully. So the story behind this is that a longtime family friend's father was a gunsmith, and he wanted a elk hunting rifle. And so he took a 1917 U.S. Enfield Action and then completely customized it, reblued it, ground off the ears, all that sort of thing, made it sightless, essentially a flat top, and then put it in this very nice replacement stock, did some trigger work to it. The trigger is the lightest trigger I've ever felt on any rifle. I mean, if you look at this thing wrong, it can go off. And the interesting thing about this, obviously with it being an elk rifle, it had to be rechambered into something a little bit harder hitting. These were originally 30-06 Springfield. This is now a 300 Winchester Magnum. So the 1917 Action is perfect for this. They're incredibly strong. And I've actually run into a few from back in the day that were 300 H&H Magnum too. So the basis behind this was a purpose-built rifle, something that was light enough that you wouldn't mind hiking in, for a relatively long distance to go and get an elk, take your 1 to 2 shots, and then hike back out. So a lightweight, hard-hitting rifle that is accurate. So the problem with that, at least for anybody that's not elk hunting with it, is that this barrel is so thin that even though it's bedded to the stock, the 300 Win Mag heats this barrel up so fast, I'm talking 2-3 shots max, and then your point of impact drifts significantly. So the gunsmith that did this did an incredible job of making a purpose-built rifle that succeeded and fulfilled its role for several decades. However, out here on the range, it's 2 shots, wait for it to cool off. 2 shots, wait for it to cool off. But again, this is how people were able to purpose build custom rifles back in the day with what they had and what was relatively inexpensive. So nowadays, 1917 Enfields command a premium because there's not that many of them left that are in original full military configuration. Whereas something like this is considered, abused hard enough to the point where this isn't really worth all that much, even though it's chambered in this fantastic long-range hunting and target shooting caliber. This is still frowned upon to the point where this commands less value versus the original, even though it's had, hours and hours more work put into it. So, again, this is one of the few examples that I think is done a little bit tastefully. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a whole host of examples that are done horrifically, but it just depends on where you fall onto the spectrum as far as military surplus goes. If you want, purebred military configuration, stuff like this will make you sick. But if you can appreciate the work that goes into something like this and creating a rifle that is purpose-built from the ground up using a military action, then you can understand you know, why I would consider this a little bit tasteful. This is an extremely controversial subject in the military surplus community, so you know, I'd love to hear your guys' opinion. So thanks for watching and happy building.